Well, it was in 2017 that a new musical festival was announced. It was self-billed as a one-of-a-kind luxury experience in the Caribbean with chef-cooked meals. Quote, at up to $100,000 per head, the Fire Festival customers had been promised white sand, luxury accommodation, and first-class food. But when they arrived, they were instead faced with rain-sodden, disaster tent city. Mattresses were pictured piled up on the floor, and some people reportedly fought over access to the limited number of tents. There were also issues with access to water, and instead of the gourmet meals, stranded festival goers were provided with limp cheese sandwiches in styrofoam boxes. When things don't turn out the way they were promised, especially at $100,000 per head. In a lot of ways, the context of the book that we're going to talk about tonight, the book of Isaiah, there were a lot of expectations for this people, the people of Israel in ancient times, the times of the Old Testament, or the First Testament. In fact, if you could summarize your Old Testament, it would be promises and anticipation. Promises and anticipation. God had made some promises. In fact, he promised his people that they would live lives free from the curse, lives free from death and sickness, and lives with him, present in the land. But this promise was also a co-promise, a promise that the people made to God, a promise that they would live their lives in accordance with the promise that God has made, in accordance with the anticipation that they had. Listen to the words of the people at Mount Sinai when that covenant was made, that pact between God and the people were made. This is what they said. All that the Lord has spoken, we will do. Exodus 19:8. When you live life with anticipation, it changes the way that you feel, the way that you think, and the way that you act. When you were a kid, maybe going to bed, knowing that the next day that you were going to go to Disneyland, or maybe that Christmas was the next morning and you saw the presents, it changed the way you went to bed. In fact, it changed the way you sleep, or maybe you tried to sleep. But the people didn't live with that anticipation, the people of Israel. In fact, they lived like they actually didn't want the promises after a certain amount of time. And they lived like they were content with the way life was. And so they lived for their immediate pleasure, the immediate pleasure of what was in front of them, at the expense of what was promised in days ahead. And this is where the book of Isaiah picks up. Tonight I want to give you an introduction to the book of Isaiah. It's just a taste test. I think Jeremy kind of promised on my behalf that I would start the book of Isaiah, and I just was not ready. And I want it to be good. And I feel like if I jumped into the first section of Isaiah, I don't think it would have as much of an impact if you didn't understand the context in which the book was written, or the ministry that the prophet Isaiah had. So tonight, it's going to be an introduction, and I think that it'll give you a better understanding of the book once we dive into the text. So tonight's talk is an introduction to Isaiah, its background, its basis, and its bird's eye view. The background, the basis, and the bird's eye view. So we'll start with point one. It's the background. So I want to give you the context, the canonical context. We'll start with the book of Genesis. So it gives you a sneak peek to Jeremy's series too, because he's going to start a series on the book of Genesis. So Genesis, God creates in order to showcase himself. He creates for his own glory. And he creates man, he creates humanity as a way to partner with them to reflect himself to creation. He gives that partnership to humanity so that they would have the responsibility, the care, and the oversight of creation, like kings and queens of creation. That's humanity's job. But in an act of insanity, man chose to attempt to steal what was already theirs. And what was already theirs? Being like God. What did Satan promise them if they disobeyed God? You'll be like God. What should they have said? We already are made in his image and likeness. So in that insanity, they defy God and choose to live life without him, to have knowledge without him. If they have instant access to this knowledge without the source of knowledge himself. So God curses creation and gives creation over to chaos. He gives order over to disorder, and sin gives way to death. But God plants very quickly a seed of hope, a promise to undo that curse through means of a descendant of the humans, a new human. The human people would have to wait for more clues along the way. And each clue gave them more insight and more of a sneak peek at what was going to be promised. And generation after generation, they would wait for more clues. And they would look to see where is the family from which that seed, that descendant would come. As man continued to flourish and grow, and generation begot generation, they continued to grow wicked. And God would give his first clue about the promise. In a judgment on this growing evil by a cleansing flood, God chooses one family. And he gives a clue that his plan would be to preserve creation, to set up his saving plan. As this family grows, God reveals another clue. He chooses a family within the family of Abraham, the people of Israel. Through them, the descendant would come. In Genesis 12, 1 through 3, it says, all the people of the world would be blessed through this people. Genesis closes from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and Judah, and he would preserve that family through adversity, and eventually the book of Exodus is next. And so God raises up Moses to rescue that family out of Egypt, out of slavery, and he meets them at Sinai to give them more clues to that promise of how would this curse be undone? Who is that descendant? And it's in the book of Leviticus that we learn about the agreement at Mount Sinai of what that promise would look like. And would look like a relationship between that family and God, a special relationship. And they would have to mirror his character in living out the law to be what humanity was called to be in the first place in Genesis, to be reflectors of his image to creation and to all the people. They would be a demonstration of the character of God. And in doing that, they would love God and they would love their neighbor. In the book of Numbers, the people leave Mount Sinai and they head to a new destination, the Promised Land, with God in the middle of their camp. And in the book of Deuteronomy, they stand on the edge of the Promised Land and they recommit to that pact that they made at Sinai. Their assignment to be a lighthouse for the whole world. And in Deuteronomy, we get another clue to what this promise would look like. What is the mystery of this promise? What are some more insights into how he's going to undo this curse? It would be a future human, and it would be the descendant would be a prophet like Moses, someone to lead them in a way that's like him but better than him. The book of Joshua recounts Israel's entry into that promised land, where they would grow into a greater nation, a beacon of light nation, which would foreshadow how that land itself would grow and impact the whole world. And eventually God would lead that land to become a new creation that reverberates to the whole earth. God's renewal of the entire creation, not just one little piece of land. And through a new Joshua, a new Yeshua, as Joshua 4:24 says, so that all the peoples of the earth might know. But even that generation that entered the land didn't fully live out God's design for them. And in the next book, the book of Judges, failure devolves into full-fledged evil. And the people for the next generations would submerge more and more. In fact, the book of Judges is a downward spiral of evil. The people doing what's right in their own eyes. The people who were supposed to be this beacon of light to the entire world would become so dark that the book of Ruth would have to move the spotlight out of Israel and onto a land outside of Israel to showcase God's saving work in spite of Israel. The land of Moab. And Jeremy preached through the book of Ruth a few months back that we found so helpful. From Ruth came a great-grandson, David, whose life is recounted in 1st and 2nd Samuel, who God raises up to lead Israel, and from whom we get another clue about this future descendant. It would be a son from his line who not only would be a leader and a prophet, but he would also be a king, and he would sit on the throne in David's dynasty. And when he would sit on the throne, the promise of the curse being broken would be fulfilled because he would sit on the throne forever. An undying king, bringing in a death to death for all people. But even as David's son Solomon prays at the dedication of the temple, that all nations and all peoples would see the beacon of light and come to worship the true God, Solomon even prays in 1 Kings 8:41-43, says, so that all the peoples of the earth might know your name. Israel wasn't blessed to just be blessed. They weren't blessed to be the spoiled children. They were on an assignment to be God's rescue mission for the whole world. But as he followed David's family in the line of Solomon to his sons, the lines of the kings get worse and worse and darker, and Israel splits into two countries with two separate lines of kings. Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The north, the northern kingdom, had 0 kings that followed in God's footsteps. 0 good kings. The southern kingdom, Judah or Jerusalem, had 8 out of 20. So a little bit better. 8 out of 20 that, quote, did what was right in the sight of the Lord. And about halfway through the last book, recounting the kings, one of them, a good one, maybe the last hope, dies. And in the midst of this people who were to be this sort of capital city of earth, a capital city that would eventually find new life for all creation, the people, they walk away from the expectation. They walk away from the anticipation. And they didn't want to be the bridge for the world. They didn't care about the new creation. This life was pretty good. It's a short life, but it's a good life. And they lived like it was all that they hoped for. To the point where 2 Chronicles 36 says this: "Furthermore, all the leaders of the priests and the people multiplied their unfaithful deeds, following all the abominations of the nations." So, this mission of being attractive, to be this beacon for the world to set their eyes on, this beacon instead sets their eyes outward to be like the very nations they're trying to reach. And instead, they look like those nations. And they defiled the house of the Lord, which he had consecrated in Jerusalem. Quote, "Again and again the Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to his people through his messengers, because he had compassion on them and on his dwelling place. But they mocked the messengers of God, his words, and scoffing at his prophets." And Isaiah steps into ministry right here. This leads us to the second point. The first point was the background. That's the background. That is the Bible. That's the Old Testament leading up to Isaiah. Number 2 is the basis of Isaiah. And so what is the content of Isaiah? The content of Isaiah is a collection of sermons. He was a preacher. That's what Isaiah did. A lot of times we think about prophets and we think, oh, they were like these fortune tellers. You know, they sit behind a crystal ball and they predict the future. But that's actually not necessarily or primarily true. A majority of what they did was they were preachers of the word. A lot of times we often get into a rut into thinking even that the prophets just, their words were just God's words, and it just became, the basis of their preaching was just their words, new revelation. But that's not the case for Isaiah. Isaiah wasn't just a preacher of his own words or new words. Isaiah was an expository preacher. One of the professors that I had in seminary, his name was Dr. Essex, he says, Isaiah was a Torah man. He preached his Bible, and his Bible was the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So he preached the word. He didn't point people to something new. He pointed people to what they already knew. He called them to live in light of what God had already said. As a way of showcasing just a taste of, to defend myself in saying that he's a Torah man, let's just look at what Isaiah exposits. Here's a summary. Deuteronomy 32 and 29, Isaiah exposits in chapter 1. Exodus 21 in Isaiah chapter 4. Genesis 1, Genesis 3, Genesis 11, and Deuteronomy 29. Exodus 19 and Deuteronomy 7 in Isaiah chapter 6. Deuteronomy 6 in Isaiah chapter 7. Exodus 14 in chapter 10, Exodus 23 in chapter 11, Deuteronomy 23 in chapter 23, Genesis 9 in chapter 24, Exodus 24, Deuteronomy 14, Numbers 24, Genesis 3 in chapter 25, Exodus 23 in chapter 40, Genesis 1, 2, Exodus 14 through 15 in chapter 43, Deuteronomy 23 in chapter 52, Genesis 9 and 54, Deuteronomy 23 and 56, Leviticus 25 and Exodus 19 in chapter 61, Exodus 23 and Deuteronomy 1 and 63, Numbers 11 and 63, Exodus 14 and 63, Exodus 15 and 63, Genesis 1 and 65, Genesis 3 and 65, and Genesis 1 and chapter 66. Isaiah was a Torah man. Their message, the prophets' messages, and Isaiah specifically, more than anything, the content of their sermons was about who God is, what he is like, what humanity is like, and what they're called to be. Primarily pointing them back to the promised plan of God, back to the clues, back to what God promised from the beginning, and living in light of that anticipation, living in light of that agreement that they had at Sinai, namely the summary of the law. Now, I'm not going to quote the New Testament because up to this point, Isaiah doesn't have that yet. So I merely am going to give you a summary, not from Galatians or from Jesus, but a summary of the law from the Ten Commandments themselves. And the summary of the law, summarized in the first half of the Ten Commandments, is love God. That's a summary of the 613 laws in the entire Torah. The other half of the Ten Commandments is love your neighbor, to which Isaiah calls out Israel for two primary sins. You could read the Old Testament and you could see it for yourself and do a survey. But you could also just look at the book of Isaiah to see what his sermons are about. And those two sins are idolatry, not loving God, and oppression, not loving neighbor. Let me give you a couple quick examples. There's more than this. Isaiah 44, starting at verse 12. The ironsmith takes a cutting tool and works it over the coals. He fashions it with hammers and works it with his strong arm. He becomes hungry, and his strength fails. He drinks no water and is faint. The carpenter stretches a line. He marks it out with a pencil. He shapes it in planes and marks it with a compass. He shapes it into the figure of a man, with the beauty of a man to dwell in a house. He cuts down cedars and chooses a cypress tree or an oak and lets it grow strong among the trees of the forest. He plants a cedar, and the rain nourishes it. Then it becomes fuel for a man. He takes part of it and warms himself. He kindles a fire and bakes bread. Also, he burns it in the fire. Over the half, he eats meat. He roasts it and is satisfied. And he warms himself and says, "Aha, I am warm. I have seen the fire." Verse 17, and the rest of it he makes into a god, his idol, and falls down to it and worships it. He prays to it and says, "Deliver me, for you are my God." Verse 18, they know not, nor do they discern, for he has shut their eyes, so they cannot see, and their hearts, so that they cannot understand. No one considers, nor is there knowledge or discernment to say, half of it I burn in the fire. I also baked bread on its coals. I roasted meat and have eaten. And shall I make the rest of it an abomination? Shall I fall down before a block of wood? He feeds on ashes. A deluded heart has led him astray, and he cannot deliver himself or say, is there not a lie in my right hand? Idolatry. Now oppression. Isaiah chapter 1, starting in verse 15. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I hide my eyes from you. Even when you offer my many prayers, I am not listening. Why? Your hands are full of blood. Wash and make yourselves clean. Take your evil deeds out of my sight. Stop doing wrong. Learn to do right. Seek justice. Defend the oppressed. Take up the cause of the fatherless. Plead the case of the widow. Isaiah 58, starting in verse 6. Isn't this the fast that I have chosen? To break the chains of wickedness, to untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and tear off every yoke? Isn't it to share your bread with the hungry, to bring the poor and homeless into your home, to clothe the naked when you see him, and not turn away from your own flesh and blood? Then your light will break forth like the dawn, and your healing will come quickly. Your righteousness will go before you, and the glory of the Lord will be your rear guard. Then you will call, and the Lord will answer. You will cry out, and he will say, Here I am. If you remove the yoke from your midst, the pointing of the finger and malicious talk, and if you give yourself to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted soul. That's the content and the basis of what Isaiah preaches. Lastly, point 3, the bird's eye view. Bird's eye view. Isaiah is broken up into 6 sections, 6 collections of sermons. Technically speaking, it's 2 trilogies, okay? The first half of the book, the first trilogy, is 3 movements, 3 collections of sermons. They're short sermons, but they're collections, and each one of those collections is around the same theme. The first 3 sections, that first trilogy, you guys are going to hate me for saying this because I say it all the time, is a sandwich. Now, a lot of people are like, yeah, you see sandwiches in everything. The reality is, people from other countries could look at our poetry and they could say, you say everything rhymes in your poetry. Because it does, and that's part of the effect of how we do poetry and how we communicate. In the same way, in ancient Israel, they liked to do mirror type of reasoning and communication. And so that's one of the things they did. They did sandwiches. And I'm pointing at JV because he makes fun of me about the sandwiches. So the first trilogy is a chiasm. And so you have the first and last that talk about the people of Israel, this beacon. Be the beacon. So what do you think the middle section, the meat of the sandwich, is talking about? If Israel's to be the light, who are they trying to reach? The nations, the world. So that is God's heart in the first half. And I'll just give you the sections real quick. Chapters 1 through 12 can be summarized as judgment and hope for Jerusalem. That middle section is judgment and hope for the nations. And the last section the third section, is the rise and fall of Jerusalem. Now, the end of that section, the end of section 3, right in the middle, is the end of Isaiah's life, okay? So his last public sermons are the end of chapter 39, okay? So the question is, where did the rest of the book come from? And the answer is, in that first part of the book, in his preaching ministry, he's telling the people, God is going to judge you because you didn't fulfill the covenant, okay? He is going to bring about judgment. So repent and go back to what you agreed to do in the first place. Then he dies. He gets killed. One of the kings kills him. He lives through 4 kings in Jerusalem. Many people think that he was actually wealthy and he was part of the royal family because he had such immediate access to the kings to have these conversations with them in person. You can't just go up to Biden's house and just have that conversation with him unless you have an inside connections. And that's a lot of the reason Bible scholars think that Isaiah had that. So in his appeal to that final king, the king didn't like what he heard and he kills Isaiah. Okay? What happens to Israel at that point? They didn't listen to him. And judgment happens in the form of Babylon that Isaiah was telling him. Babylon's coming. Babylon is the judgment. Turn now. They didn't listen. Babylon comes, takes them away. 150 years later, they're in exile. They're living in Babylon, okay? And what happens? They find a posthumous collection, a trilogy written by Isaiah. Imagine a father writing a letter to his kids, knowing he's going to die. And after his death, the kids open up the letter, and he says, "You're probably reading this, and I'm gone." That's the last half of Isaiah. The people read that, and you can see in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 16, Isaiah 29, 10 through 12, and Isaiah 38 through 9, Isaiah kept these things written down to be opened later, okay? So they open up his writings, this second trilogy, and he doesn't just say, "You're going to do this. This is going to happen to you. You're going to be..." He says this, "You're probably reading this, and you're in exile right now." That's exactly how it's written. It's written in the first person present, as if Isaiah is living in the midst of them. And the last trilogy is this, and I'll just give it to you. Here are the three sections. Chapters 40 through 48 is a message of hope, but it's also a defense that God is fulfilling his promise. Because in the midst of that, he's basically telling his kids, he's telling Israel, "You're in exile right now, but there's hope." And then he says, "But you're saying right now, yeah, right, we're in exile. God doesn't care about us." And so Isaiah, in that first section, gives a defense for that this is all part of the plan. This is the discipline of a father. It's all going according to plan, just like I told you. But there's hope. That's the first section. The second section is 49 through 55. And I would title this, "The Servant Fulfills God's Mission." The mission that the people of Israel were called to be, this light to the whole world, that humanity was called to be, mirroring God's character. It's just not possible. And God sympathizes in this middle section. He says, "I know you can't be the humans that you were called to be. That's why I'm sending ... the next clues about who that would be. And that is the servant. He will live the life that you could never live. And he will accomplish it on your behalf. And he will love God with all his heart, soul, mind, and strength. And he will love his neighbor as himself. But you know what? He will take on the judgment that you deserve. And he will grant you the ability to live that life that you are meant to live. That's the middle section, which leaves us with the final section of Isaiah, and that's chapter 56 through 66. And that is, the servants inherit God's kingdom. And that is what comes from that middle section. It's that God is enabling his servants to now live on mission, to be that beacon of light for the whole world. Not just the people of Israel, but all those who would be called by God's name. I'm going to close with Isaiah 61, and this is in that final section. You don't have to turn, just listen. And this is a promise of hope. And you will be called priests of the Lord. You will be called priests of the Lord in light of what the servant has done to enable you to be these servants. And you will be named servants of our God. You will feed on the wealth of the nations, and their riches you will boast. Verse 10, I delight greatly in the Lord. My soul rejoices in my God, for he has clothed me with the garments of salvation and has arrayed me in a robe of his righteousness, as a bridegroom adorns his head like a priest, and as a bride adorns herself with her jewels. For as the soil makes the sprout come up, and a garden causes seeds to grow, so the sovereign Lord will make righteousness and praise spring up before all nations. This is salvation for the whole world. And so Isaiah points to the means of restoration, not only for Israel, but for all nations and the whole earth. This is new creation life. And our response, I think, to something like this, just an introduction to Isaiah, and when you dive into Isaiah, I would say, don't do the shortcut to a quick fix application. I would ask you, Valley, to, when you see the greatness of God in the book of Isaiah, just simply be enamored with the story of God. That's the easiest application. Enjoy the story and enjoy the God of the story. I'm looking forward to the study of Isaiah with you guys. Let's pray. Father, I pray that you would open our eyes to behold wonderful things in your word, and that we would have a better grasp of your word. We would see Christ. We would see the anticipation of the Old Testament, really that look ahead to the promise that was fulfilled in your Son, the servant who accomplished what we could never accomplish, to be enabled by faith to live in light of his work. I pray that as the Son of Man didn't come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many, I pray that we would not think that we can now just live it up and go back to square one of enjoying life as it is. But God, I pray that we would mirror the character of that servant, that we too would not live to be served, but to serve and to give our lives away for many. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.